Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for getting up so early in this marvelous 9:30 slot. So, we did it. We did it. We did the deed that some said they said it couldn't be done. They said it shouldn't be done. There are still many who say it shouldn't have been done. Okay. Now, I know there's many of you here from all kinds of nations today, and I'm not going to stand here and bore you about whether we should or shouldn't have done the whole Brexit thing. We've done it, okay. But I do want to put this into some perspective, because what has happened, make no mistake, is huge. This is the hugest thing that has happened to our nation in probably centuries, bar the Second World War and First World War, okay. But it will affect everybody, and it potentially affects everybody in Europe. And what I want to do this morning is to sort of get a wider perspective on this, because as I think we all know, the general views that were put back and forth during the campaigns were not very well put. And there really is something much bigger to talk about here. And what I want to do is to get some context as to why it's happened, look at where we're going to go with this, and indeed see how we can survive this shock of the new, which it certainly is. Now, even those that voted here to leave, that next morning, when actually it found out they were on the winning side unexpectedly, it was really disorientating. I think a lot of people literally were walking around, and it was like the world was different. Did you feel that too, some of you? And it was really disorientating, make no mistake. And it literally was as if you'd gone into a parallel dimension. And to some degrees, we had. And I think there was an energetic wave of shock that went through not only our nation, but also around the world. And of course, there have been all kinds of interesting reactions from a number of different places. Here, this is a French newspaper here. And there is, look, Little Britain strung up on the wire. Good luck. Love it. So is this the case? Is this where we're now at? Little Britain strung up on a wire, no hope, going to fade away into some backwater. Well, what I want to show today is, if you look back through history, you will find that that actually generally isn't what happens when we get written off. We've been written off as a nation many times. And I'm not here to do some big jingoistic flag-waving thing, all right? We've sung Jerusalem already. But I do want to sort of see that this might not be quite what some people think it is. So, yes, the campaigns were appalling. Everybody knew they were appalling. Lies were told, horrible lies, on both sides. And we could argue till kingdom come as to whether that should or shouldn't have happened. And of course, it shouldn't happen. But then, if an election were to be disregarded on the basis of lies being told, well, we haven't had a legitimate government for the last 200 years, probably, probably ever. Some of you will have read my articles. If you haven't, go onto my website, truthagenda.org. I wrote 2 articles in the run-up to the vote and then an article after. And I was really overwhelmed by the response that I got to those articles. They were designed to try to get away from the Punch and Judy show that was going on around the whole Brexit thing, and to go deeper and try to understand what the real issues were. And I mean, I'm glad to say I had a lot of people saying that really helped. And yes, I did in one of the articles say which way I felt we should go, but I left it open in another article just to see where the land lies. So let's level. I did vote to leave. I stand by that. It doesn't mean I don't appreciate there are issues, and it doesn't mean I don't appreciate there are some people who feel very bad about what's happened. And make no mistake, we at the symposium here, we are not of one mind. I think there was 3 Remainers to 2 Leavers. So we had to deal with a conflict that many people had to in families and at work, and it's still going on today. But I do want to show that that conflict is potentially being used to divide us, and we need to be ever so careful how we deal with what is about to come. So yes, if you were on the winning side, suddenly it was a miraculous day. But of course, if you were on the losing side, you might have felt suddenly, hang on a minute, this isn't the way it was meant to have gone. And of course, many of the pre-vote polls said that Remain was almost certainly going to win, if only by a narrow margin. But it went the other way. And there's a number of reasons, I think, why it went the other way. And pre-vote polls, we are now discovering, are not generally very accurate, are they? Because often you find there are strange undercurrents going on that did not get reflected when people were talking about these things in advance. So, why? Why have we decided to go our own sweet way? And when have we done this before? And has it worked before? So, there we are, standing in some level of isolation. We won't really be isolated because, and I want to say this immediately, by the way, we are European. We are a European nation. We always will be. That is not the same, though, as saying we should be part of the EU. Do you see the difference? The European Union is a kind of an official body. Europe is a continent, and we are part of Europe. And nobody wants to separate that. We love everybody in Europe, or we should do. If you don't, you're a fool, okay? But that's not what this was all about. Let's go back in time for a minute. It's worth a look at some of the myths and legends of this nation. And they might explain why the vote went the way it did. And these are things that a lot of people don't seem to be aware of. Even if you're not consciously aware of these myths and legends, you might still carry this somewhere in the collective. In fact, you do. So let's go back. Once upon a time, in the days of the Greek gods, Neptune had a son, and that son was a giant. And that giant was called Albion. And Albion needed somewhere to live, and he was given this island. And he called it, would you believe, Albion. And Albion then gave birth, somehow or another, to a race of giants, until one day Heracles turned up and killed Albion. But the giants that he'd created, they carried on. The goddess Diana, though, one day, worried about the state of the city of Troy, decided a new Troy, a second Troy was needed. So she ordered Brutus of Troy to go to the land of Albion and kill the remaining giants and set up a new Troy. And the duty of those in this new nation would be to kill giants and basically rule as the new Troy. Now, there are other variations on this myth, and William Blake had his own version, but we'll just stick with this one for the moment. Now, some of you may not know this myth, but this was quite a well-known myth until about certainly 100, 150 years ago. And what the myth therefore says is that we are, and I'm not saying it's true, but this is what the myth says, we are a chosen nation. And that's always very deeply embedded somewhere in our blood, that we have been selected above other nations for greater things. Now, you could see that as overinflated ego, which it might be, but nonetheless, it's very much there. And this has had a big effect. Interestingly, if you go to Cannon Street in London, there's a little hole in the wall where there is this stone. And this is called the Brutus stone. And it is said it's from a temple that Brutus built in honor of the goddess Diana when he arrived here. And that temple originally stood on where the Guildhall is today. So, where we have our important buildings, you often find this was sacred soil for a long, long time. And it's just interesting that to this day, there's a lot of strange mystique around this stone. Now, we don't really know the whole story of the stone. That could be utter myth. It could be from anywhere. But nonetheless, it makes you realize that these myths and legends, we still carry them. And those that set up the British Empire were very aware of this. There were people who were leading the colonialism who absolutely believed that it was their mission to kill giants and create the new Troy. And there, all the pink bits, they were the British Empire. And there are many bad things about the way the empire was set up. But nonetheless, the achievement was massive. Was it based on the right ideals? That's another matter. Then we get King Arthur. And here in Glastonbury, of course, the King Arthur myth is very alive and well to this day. And it's sort of a continuation of the Brutus myth, that sense of being a chosen race and this mystical figure who will one day come back and save us all. And of course, we have at the core of all that the Holy Grail myths. And they've gradually got added into the story as the years have gone by. But again, what does it say? It says that somewhere deep in our core we believe, however wrongly, we believe that God has selected us to guard the sacred ornament, to guard the sacred divine truths. It falls to this nation. Madness? Maybe. But we carried that, and when we were having to make our decision, I think that was stronger than some people knew. Even if you didn't know it consciously, it was there. And it was interesting because in the run-up to the vote, I was trying to hear everyone's views and talk to everyone. And quite a lot of Remainers, and I hate to divide people into Leavers and Remainers, but, it's a kind of an easy shorthand. They didn't really want to be in the EU, many of them, but it was the money that was worrying them. Saying, well, but what will we do? What if we do collapse, as some are saying, and I've got to think of my family and my job? Reasonable enough. And yet, there was a conflict in there because this isn't really who we are as a nation. We're not supposed to be ruled by other people. That is not what is at the core of the myths in our nation. And, here's another thing, right? We've got a long history of repelling European invaders. The Romans showed up, originally in 54 BC, Julius Caesar. He didn't like it much here, by the way. He sort of admired the spirit of the people, but it was raining a lot, and anyway, he cleared off pretty soon. And we know because we got his diaries. Incredible, you can read what he thinks. And then Claudius came back about a century later and then did a full-on invasion. And from those times, we get the myths and legends of Boudica, or Boadicea, depending on how you were taught. And you see, this is an interesting one. We still hold her up today as being this incredible figure that fought the invaders. She led a rebellion for long and complicated reasons. She keeps coming back in fiction over the years. So we still look to this figure, who we know almost nothing about the real person, as someone that stood up. She stood up for our nation against the invaders. And look, there's even a Lego Boudica that you can get. So she's very much somewhere there in our bloodstream. So these are the kind of things we've all been brought up with over the centuries. This is what we do. We fight invaders. We don't get ruled by other people. And, of course, here is the irony, and it has a resonance with what's going on now. We are a nation made up of many other bloodlines, as most nations are. And after the Romans collapsed, we got settled or invaded, depending on how you want to look at it, from a lot of people from the continent, Scandinavia, mainland Europe. And in they came, and gradually they became us, okay? Bloody foreigners coming over here, becoming us. There's something similar going on now, because in the campaigns, actually, there were quite a lot of leavers who were black or Asian or whatever, people who maybe you wouldn't have expected, because it's only a few generations back that their people came here, to have been then wanting to push out others. But it's quite similar to here. And they just got settled. Some idea of what our nation was just getting settled when then the Vikings showed up. And by the way, no, the Vikings did not have horns on their helmets. That's actually accurate. That's a myth that they had horns on their helmets. So you've learned something there. But then, so suddenly, just as we'd seemed to get settled, no, back to war again. And we get another figure who fights for our freedom, King Alfred. If you go down to Winchester, there's the famous statue of Alfred. And, we all remember him for burning cakes, yes? But he did a bit more than that. That's so British, isn't it? Stuff everything else he did. He burnt the cakes. He was very good at pushing back the invaders, and actually he pretty much started to create England as we know it. We'll come to Britain later. So he pushed the Vikings back into an area known as the Danelaw, and then established, and this is really important, a strong rule of law a rule of law which many nations have looked to since. And that's held us together through many crises. Now, eventually the Danes would get their own king, King Canute and all of that, okay. But nonetheless, the idea of England began around this time and this unified nation. But then, of course, the Normans show up. So the Europeans are back, and in they come, and it's a pretty successful invasion. And they're pretty savage in their retribution against anybody that stood in their way. And we then became, in many ways, very French. And that lasted for quite a few centuries. But there was always a resentment, of course, about this new French aristocracy. Excuse me if you are French, by the way. Not having a go at you personally, but historically, there was a resistance to that French aristocracy. It seemed like that was imposing over real life over here. And of course, gradually the bloodlines began to mix. And in the end, again, we kind of got back to some sense of what was now being, you could say, Britishness, okay? But then, of course, it all changed. Henry VIII comes along, and at this stage, the general ruler of Europe is the Pope in Rome, okay? But when Henry VIII goes through his crises and he wants to marry Anne Boleyn, and you all know the stories of the 6 wives and all of that, it creates a massive constitutional crisis that creates divisions that have ripples that go forever from this moment. And we still live with them today, by the way, right? This was a massive moment in history. And again, it has resonance with what's going on now, where we turned against Europe. And whether it was for the right or the wrong reasons, because Henry had other reasons to want to break away. And a lot of people in England, especially at this time, felt that the rule of Rome was too much. They wanted more of a sense of independence, even without the whole Anne Boleyn business, okay. So the Pope over in Rome, who at this point was Pope Clement VII, he was kind of like the Jean-Claude Junckers of his day, right? And he was suddenly the enemy. And that is why across Britain there are still many anti-papist traditions, particularly Lewes in Sussex, where I was born. They have this big bonfire night thing, and, you know, they have these no popery banners. There's nobody in Lewes that thinks that. It's just a tradition, right, despite what the tabloids say. But it comes from these times where the Pope was then promoted as a foreign tyrant and an oppressor who would take away the sovereignty of England. And he was. Right, that's the political reality of those times, because he was as much a political figure as a religious figure. But of course, then we fought back, and Henry brought out the big guns, characters like Thomas Cromwell. And if you saw Wolf Hall a year or so back, you'll have some vague idea of what happened around those times. So Cromwell realizes that the way to basically break away from Rome and from European rule is to take back the money. And the way you did that in those days was to destroy the monasteries. And that's why, just literally a few yards from this building, you've got a ruined abbey. Because, of course, by taking back the wealth from the Catholic Church, you then reduce the risk of a kind of a fifth column operating here. Because now the king had put himself at the head of the church. And thus, especially in those days, where you believe that person that speaks for God is the ultimate authority on earth, he was the authority on the whole planet. Understand? Right? That's how big it was in those days. So to have suddenly replaced the Pope with the king here being now in charge of everything, we had said, once again, we have the divine speaking just through our nation. And all the rest are frauds. Okay? And that's what it boils down to. Now, by the time we get to the reign of Elizabeth, we are seen around, certainly around Europe as a failed state, right? We've broken free. We're not liked. There's great resentment. And of course, very famously, the Spanish sent the Armada to come and get us, but it all got wrecked and ruined and defeated. And suddenly, when everybody had written us off, actually, we started to do quite well. And we begin the slow ascent to empire. And again, I'm not going to, go through some big moralistic hand-wringing over the empire. It happened, and certainly made us, for a while, the biggest nation on earth. But we believed that was our right, that was our duty. And these things are important to know. And by the time you get to the early 1600s, now the monarch has been brought up absolutely to believe he is speaking for God on earth. And Charles I got himself into a lot of trouble with this. Because Charles I thought, well, who should be telling me what to do? He didn't like Parliament very much. Because if he is speaking for God, who the hell are these people sitting in Parliament telling him what taxes he can have and what wars he can fight? Surely it was his divine right to make that choice. But of course, this is where the beginnings of some enlightenment came in, because it came to conflict. And the English Civil Wars, you could do a 3-hour talk on. It was long, it was bloody. It's often portrayed as this very romantic time of cavaliers and roundheads, when the reality is it was appalling. Proportionally, as many English people died in that war as died in World War I. It was absolutely huge. And Scotland and Ireland were also involved. And that is why some people, in fact, call it the War of the Three Kingdoms. But again, a lot of nations said, that's it for Britain. They're finished. And instead, it turned out to be quite the opposite. Interesting point. So, the parliamentarians eventually come to be led by Oliver Cromwell, who was hated by many people, looked up to by others. And Cromwell's an interesting character, but he 100% believed he was speaking for God. And of course, by rebelling against the king, what you're saying is, hang on a minute, so first it was the Pope in Rome who called the shots, then it was the king, but hang on a minute, now you're saying it's some general? Who speaks for God? Who is the divine voice on earth? These are really big issues. So, here's the problem. Because Cromwell absolutely believes that he is God on earth, he imposes his ideas more widely. And he was one of those that believed that England was meant to carry on the work of the Israelites. Now, Cromwell absolutely believed this. He thought that the Israelite mission was to continue here. And if you go to the House of Commons today in the lobbies and you look at the paintings, you will see that belief is well up there in the symbolism. And to this day, there are many MPs that are friends of Israel, the members of this, and that is why we will never turn against Israel, because it is an absolute belief. We are with them. We are part of that mission. And you can agree or disagree with that, but that is the case. And interestingly, Jeremy Corbyn, of course, is very not friendly towards Israel. And that may be one of the reasons why a lot of people don't like him. There's wider stuff going on here than you may know. And I'm not saying what's right or wrong here. It's just a fact of what happened. So the king gets defeated and then eventually executed. So hang on a minute, you've just killed God. Well, you have, haven't you? If he was God's envoy on earth, what have you done? And suddenly you've handed power over to a bunch of people in Parliament led by, an equally fervent religious mind. But suddenly it throws everything into doubt. And it looked at this stage like we were going to collapse and fall away and be an utterly useless nation. But actually, instead, what came out of it is this: many different ideas. So people say, well, hang on then. So as we've now killed God and all bets are off, why don't we just start everything again? You get interesting discussions going on around this time. You get the Putney debates, and the Putney debates in 1647, the details of them were lost for many centuries, but they've been rediscovered in more recent times. And they actually discussed universal suffrage. They actually discussed changing everything so that everybody was equal. Nobody had ever discussed this before. You had groups like the Levelers saying, right, yeah, all bets are off. Let's level the playing field. Let's create utopia. Let us start again, and we'll do it here. We'll do it here in Britain, because we're now in the perfect place to start again. And other people started to come up with all kinds of ideas. You had groups like the Diggers, who believed God had given the land to everyone, so landowners couldn't come in and say they owned it. And they went around digging up public land and growing food because they believed it was their right to do so. You had the Ranters. They got very sexually adventurous because they believed, well, God made us. We are therefore in God's image. We are therefore pure. So anything we do is also pure, however rude it may be. And more soberly, you had the Quakers, and they believed God spoke through everyone. That, in a way, for them, settled the arguments about who speaks for God. And I think this is more something that I would imagine many people here would believe. He ultimately speaks through everybody. And this was the beginning of those times. And the nonconformist movements that came out of these times would change Britain enormously. And so out of that division actually came a new unity in the beginning of a new Enlightenment that changed the world. Many objected. That famous pamphlet, The World Turned Upside Down. People at the time say, what are you doing? This is madness. You've gone crazy. But have we gone crazy? Or was it a necessary time where you put everything back on the table for discussion and you look at who you are as a nation and what you are and what you can do in the world? And soon after all of this, the empire really gets going. And before we know it, we're running much of the world, for good or for ill. So when I see things like this today, and we keep seeing it, divided Britain. Notice how many times we keep hearing that? It becomes a meme after a while that becomes actually divisive in itself. Divided Britain. But then you look back at history, when Britain's been most divided, that's usually when we begin our ascent to actually great power. And I'm not saying we're going to rebuild the empire, because we don't need an empire and the world's changed. But the times we're in now, even if it wasn't what you wanted, could lead to unexpected things that might be better than some are saying. And don't forget, also, out of the civil wars came more of a parliament than we know today. Parliament before was slightly different, but this kind of party system, Whigs and Tories, that grew very much out of the Civil War years, and eventually would set the model for parliamentary democracies around the world. Now, Parliament was very prone to corruption at this stage, and here we are today, and it's still quite prone to corruption. But it is a system that has set the model for many around the world. They often call Britain the mother of democracy, okay? I am not under any illusions, as any of you that have seen my talks before will know. There's huge reform needed. There is too much corruption. The system stinks in many ways. But, and now I am just purely speaking personally, but it is a system I can influence to a degree. We can, theoretically, replace everyone there. At the last general election, around 12 million people didn't vote. If those 12 million people had all voted for one party, even the monster raving loony party, the monster raving loonies would now be in power. We have more democracy than we know, and this is something that we don't understand well enough. And this is why some people, including me, felt very uncomfortable about the idea of handing over these centuries of building to something reasonably fair, and then handing it to a group of people that we don't know, that we can only influence to a small degree, who have ambitions and agendas of their own that certainly don't necessarily fit the model we've been in for centuries. Yes, we have Euro MPs, but unfortunately, there are many big decisions they are not making. Most of the really big decisions are made behind closed doors from people we cannot directly influence. Now, I'm just speaking personally here. It was that above everything that made me think, I don't feel comfortable with this. And there have been many talks from this very stage over the years saying how the EU superstate that is set to come into being, and it is, if you don't believe that, read the treaties. And I'm appalled, by the way, how few people have ever read the original treaties that led to the creation of Europe, right? That will be where we will go. We'll be part of a superstate. And so many speakers here have said this is the beginning absolutely of the Orwellian totalitarian system. Okay, now you might not agree with that. I know there are people in this room that wouldn't agree with that. It is how I felt, and it's how many people clearly in the nation felt. Although, it's of course not quite as subtle as that. One thing that I've noticed in the last few weeks post-vote is people trying to change what they thought it was about. And some people, even people who have made big noises about immigration, said, oh, it wasn't about immigration. Sorry, it was. It was a big part for many people, not the overriding one maybe, but to deny that the issue of immigration was an issue. I'm sorry, it was an issue. But here's the problem, right? There are some issues around immigration. It needs looking at. It's not the same as talking, as some have said, completely falsely, by the way, about repatriation or pogroms against foreigners. I'm sorry, I didn't hear anybody talking about that in the run-up to the election. Who's talking about that? But there's people putting stuff around on social media today implying that. No one said that. Britain would fall apart tomorrow if we sent everyone back. We need immigration. We need free flow. And what's going to happen with the Brexit and what agreements we come to, okay, it may be we wind up with a great British fudge where actually not much changes and actually we won't be in much better position. But we'll see about that. But to say immigration wasn't an issue, right, it was. But that's not the same as saying that anybody that had an issue with immigration was a bigot or a fascist. I really object to that. There are issues around immigration because I feel that that needs looking at. Does that mean me a bigot or a fascist? And I'm getting sick of hearing people saying that that must be the case. If you voted Leave, you're a bigot. Bollocks. That is a lie. Thank you. Indeed. Right, that is simply not true. It is provably untrue. Now, don't get me wrong. There are some bigots in our nation. Excuse me. There are bigots, and it's probably true that bigots were more likely to vote Leave. But that is not the same as saying if you voted Leave, you are a bigot. Let's lose this, because all of this is classic divide and rule. We are being played at the moment. We're a massive experiment now. I don't think the world expected us to do what we've done. There are conspiracy theories that say the whole Brexit vote's a manipulation. It was called into being so we can be made an example of. Possibly, but actually I don't feel in my gut that that's what's happened. I think we've surprised the powers that be. I think they thought they had it in their hand, and suddenly Britain's done what it always does, as we've just seen historically. It does something utterly unexpected, and everybody realizes, hang on, this wasn't what was supposed to happen. But the divide and rule is coming in. We are being set against each other. And the savagery that we're seeing, especially on social media, between Leave and Remainers, and I'm sad to say, often it's the Remainers now that are the most vocal because they lost. This is extremely corrosive. Now, I acknowledge, had the vote gone the other way, there probably would have been a lot of annoyance from the other side. But the interesting thing was, in the run-up to the vote, I found most Leavers were already shrugging, looking at the polls, saying we probably lost, we did what we could, and we're going into that thing, all right, I'll have to accept we're in the slow sort of hill down to totalitarianism. We'll find a way to make it work. But what's happened is the vote went the other way, and now there's this incredible aggression that is not helpful to anybody at all. And look at how easily we get played. The death of the MP Jo Cox was clearly extremely tragic. If you're not aware of this, if you do come from somewhere else, an MP in the run-up to the vote was murdered by, as far as we can tell, a mentally ill person. Clearly deranged, but he shouted something like, stand up for Britain as he murdered her. Now, we've no idea until this goes to trial exactly what's going on there. But of course it was used to tarnish anybody voting Leave. And some say, oh no, it wasn't. I'm sorry, did you read the headlines? MP dead after attack by Brexit gunmen. Right, I rest my case. And it's worth bearing in mind this, okay? Had the Jo Cox incident not happened, the vote for Leave probably would have been much bigger, okay? And it was definitely used, I think abhorrently used, to score points, because what has happened clearly is tragic. But we're being divided in so many ways. Even before the vote, another thing, have you noticed how the young and the old are being set against each other? And of course then, when we got to the whole Brexit thing, that was really played. The young have been betrayed. They've been betrayed by all these oldies. It's the young's future. They should be deciding this. Let's look at that, shall we? Is it true that the young, right, all wanted to remain in the EU? Is this true? Let's have a look at the statistics. So if you're in the 18 to 24 bracket, okay, and this is a BBC chart I'm using here, and it's generally accepted to be accurate. Yes, all right, fair enough. Most of them did vote to remain. That is true. But then when you start to get into the 25 to 34 bracket, well, 38% of them voted to leave. And then when you start to get up from that into the 35 age group, it's pretty half and half. So it's not as clear cut as some would have you believe. And bear this in mind also. Many young people did not vote. There are many arguments about what the percentage of here. Let's be generous and go for the lesser one. It is averaging out, as far as we know, that of the eligible voters, 40% of young people did not vote. So they didn't care that much, really, did they? Think about this, because we're being told the entire young voted Remain. Well, we don't know that because many of them didn't vote. So we don't actually know what they wanted. And there was a lot of talk in the run-up to the election, people over 60 shouldn't vote. I heard worse than that. People under 50 shouldn't vote. Now, on that basis, out of all the people we see here queuing to vote, only him would be allowed to vote. Is that democracy? Okay, let's level. Right, I'm 51. I could, with good innings, have nearly half my life in front of me, right? If I don't fall under a bus or anything, okay? Some might want me to, but I'm not going to. Well, I might, but I hope not to. Okay, so I could have half my life in front of me. So I'm being told I cannot make a decision that affects my next 40, 50 years. And only the young must decide. What the hell is that about? This is pathetic, right? I suspect most of us in here are, well, if 25, right, up to 25 is young, the rest of us are old, yes? Right, okay, that's the conclusion you have to come to. I mean, just to show I'm not a racist or a bigot, let's quote some Islam, shall we? We need both. We need the energy of the young, we need the wisdom of the elders. He who does not show mercy to the young and show esteem for elders is not one of us, okay? We've got into this division, the young versus the old. We need both. You need the energy, the vibrancy of the young, but you also need the perspective and the wisdom of those who are older. And some cultures recognize this. That's been forgotten in our culture. I remember here in the earlier days of the symposium when I was kind of young, Stanley Messenger, a man, when I first knew him, probably in his 70s, by the end on here in his 80s, we looked up to Stanley. We were young and we respected his wisdom. I don't remember thinking, oh, he's an oldie, he shouldn't be up here. We need to remember this. We recognize that there was a wisdom there that we did not have. And maybe one day I'll be sitting there on a chair when I'm in my 80s, unless I've been kicked out of here by then, all right? We need both. And here's an irony. Some of the very bitter old men that run the EU are the very people some people think shouldn't be voting anymore. But some think it's absolutely fine to support that. It's a difficulty. I mean, one thing I did notice also, a lot of people have a very idealized view of the EU, which is lovely, as to the utopia they want it to be. Now, that's lovely, and I still believe anybody that wants to be in the EU should now fight to create that. But I don't think that's what it is today. And much of the sort of ideals that Europe was set up on was for corporate interests. It certainly was not to look after the interests of us. If you think it was, you really need to go and read the treaties and read the works of people like Jean Monnet, who was key in setting up the EU. It was about money, it was about power, it was about corporate interests. If we can exist within that, that's fine, but we are not the priority. And that is my viewpoint. But go back to this young versus the old, right? At Glastonbury, they showed right at the beginning, right, on the day when the vote was going on, the first thing they showed at Glastonbury was a video all about Jo Cox. Very manipulative. And then, as the weekend went on, we got people on the stage ranting about the way the vote had gone. Even kids like Damon Albarn, 48. Democracy has failed us, he's told us. Has it? How did democracy fail us? Can you explain that? As far as we know, the vote was real. I haven't heard many people saying it was rigged. It was actually one of those unusual times where it was proportional representation because, it was either or, which was unusual. Everyone could vote, any age, okay, legitimate age. As we've just heard, unfortunately, many of the younger people chose not to vote for reasons of their own. How was it not democratic? Right, did democracy fail us or did certain people fail democracy? because I think that's more likely what happened. Some leavers took it too far, I accept, all right? And there was a cheapness of the way certain things got represented on that side. But, so some people that couldn't walk to their local polling station were more than happy to do a long walk around London protesting against the way the vote went, because they were talking to people on the march and say, "Did you vote, sir?" "Well, no, but I want to make my feelings known." "Well, why didn't you do that at the ballot box?" Don't tell me democracy's failed us when you didn't try to use it in the first place, all right? And listen, I'm not saying I don't understand the disappointment and the anger of those, right, who wanted to remain. I do, and I have close friends that wanted to remain. But I do take issue with some of the things that have been said. There is a petition, of course, going round. It's partly fraudulent, there's many fake names on it and all the rest of it, but it shows, yes, there's a big strength of feeling that people still want to remain and they want it rethought. Problem is, if you start listening to street protests and petitions and not the ballot box, you're on the road to mob rule. That's the danger. Yes, everybody should be free to make their feelings known, and people have made their feelings known on both sides. There's protests about invoke Article 50 now. The trouble is, though, if you start saying, yeah, we'll listen to the mob, right, law and order's finished and democracy is finished, there's many people that want to turn the clock back. In my view, it won't happen. You might get another referendum, say, on the terms that we reach with the EU. I think that is possible. I don't think there's going to be another yes-no referendum, and I think it would be a disaster if that were to occur without some real big sea change going on. And two things that it would do if we did go back: you can wave goodbye to the economy. Wave goodbye. Because what the world is wanting now from us is stability. And it's just beginning to show signs of, okay, maybe. Britain hasn't collapsed. The pound hasn't gone as low as some said it would. Yes, there are people that are going to suffer from it, but will more people benefit in the long run? Now, that remains to be seen. We don't know. But now other nations are saying, okay, let's see. If you suddenly said, oh, no, we're going to have a revote, we're not sure, actually. Right, bye-bye economy. They're all going to withdraw their money and say, right, that's it. They are a failed state. And if you were to try to go back in that way, you're going to have riots, you're going to have civil unrest, and then we would be back into a situation not unlike what led to the English Civil Wars. And yes, we came out well from that ultimately, but only after about 20 years of strife. Do we want that now? So if we're going to try to change things, it has to be done in a different spirit. If you're not happy with the way the vote went, okay, fine. But trying to turn the clock back isn't the way forward. There's a court case going on right now, right? Because some people want Article 50 to be invoked, but somebody's taking a court case to say Parliament must vote this through. Because Parliament doesn't have to listen to the referendum. It could vote to stay in the EU. But here's the problem. If it did that, what it would show you is it's not speaking for the nation anymore. It would be overriding the will of the nation. Yes, it was a narrow result, I accept that, but it was democratic. If Parliament turned against that, you've got the end, right, of law and order and stability. I don't think that's going to happen. I think if Parliament were to vote it down, that would be a very dangerous moment. I don't think it will happen, but people really need to think through what it is they want if Parliament were to do that. Something else that didn't get considered, and another divide and rule thing that's being used in the vote, the left-wingers, were expected to vote to remain. And actually, what turned it in a lot of places like Wales and Sunderland, industrial areas that had had a lot of investment from the EU, they were expected to vote remain and they didn't. And they actually said, we've got other issues we're worrying about, and we are worried about immigrant workers, and we are worried about austerity, and I don't see the EU putting that right, so I'm going to vote to leave. And that changed everything. That was not expected. And of course, the left is having a bit of a time of it. The class war, right, that's being stirred up from this is phony. Yet there are class divides in our nation, absolutely. But this is how, right, many people have personified the leavers, right? The unwashed, I think that's what it was called, the great unwashed, have spoken their ignorant minds, right? Now, that is so derisory, but, I mean, here's the thing. You can prove that that wasn't true. If anybody drove around some of the nice country estates, you'd see as many Vote Leave posters there in these nice moneyed areas as you would in working class areas. So actually, it was across the board. I give many talks to quite posh sort of gentlemen at dinners, and I can tell you the majority I spoke to were Leavers. They're not working class left, right? They're not the ignorant masses. They're people running the show. So there's a lot of stuff being said at the moment that actually, when you look at it, is simply not true. The left is, of course, currently in trouble. Corbyn, Jeremy Corbyn, who in many eyes has been a breath of fresh air in Parliament, because he seems to have principles, and he seems to bring a refreshing note of sobriety to the Commons and all of that. He sort of was ostensibly supporting Remain, but was a bit weak. Traditionally, he'd always thought we ought to leave, of course. But of course now, that's being used to get rid of Corbyn. They're saying he didn't lead the party well enough. And yet, is that true? What I think the mistake was made was that the masses of the left would just go with whatever the party said, and they didn't. And the reason they didn't was they sort of knew Corbyn wasn't standing by his principles here. He'd been forced to kind of take a line he didn't really believe in. And he might have done better just to have stood his ground like he did over Trident. For many, he's still the saviour. He's the people's saviour. And the way the vote coming up soon goes is going to be really interesting. We shall see. Because what you've got are the majority of his MPs not supporting him, but as far as we can see, the majority of the party members do support him. And it's illustrating again how often the people sitting in Parliament don't actually represent us. They represent their own needs. And where that's going to go, I don't know. But it's going to be very interesting. But it's being used to create, definitely, more divide and rule. Beware. Irony of ironies, Corbyn's vilified for being a very weak Remainer. Theresa May, who was another very weak Remainer, has been made Prime Minister as a reward. So Theresa May was quite clever. She kept her head down. And she was obviously seeing which way the wind was going to blow. And she said, I support Remain, but didn't say it very loudly. And now, of course, she's been elevated. Here's the danger, though. And this is where I think we need to be very clear. I am not under any illusions here. The Brexit vote was not the end of the fight for freedom. It's the beginning of the fight for freedom. I mean, it is Theresa May who's been behind the whole Snoopers Charter. She wants more control, more surveillance. She supports fracking, as indeed most of this government does, for instance. She wants privatisation of the NHS. Look at her friends in private healthcare places, okay? Extremism, right? We heard yesterday she wants to clamp down on extremism, but doesn't quite define what extremism is. And people like ourselves could easily find ourselves being promoted as extremists in future. We've got problems, okay? And I am more than aware we've still got the Daleks to deal with in Westminster. And if you don't know what a Dalek is, I feel very sorry for you. But listen, and this is me personally just speaking now, at least I feel I live in a country where if I want, I can at least change the colour and shape of my Daleks, all right? They're still Daleks, but I know who they are, and I know where I stand with them, as opposed to faceless Daleks somewhere in the background, Davros somewhere, who I can't vote for. So this is one of the issues that I personally felt. Over the other side of the pond, what a choice, eh? What a choice. And the temptation to have Trump with wild hair was obviously strong, but as Jason did that yesterday, I thought I wouldn't. What we have coming up is another huge change. If we are to survive the shock of the new, not only here and in Europe and in America, we're going to have to really steel ourselves. Because I think the next few years, whichever way the vote goes there, we are going to have some interesting times. And it's happening because people want change. And there's a good side to it. People recognize change is needed. But of course, they always go for the quick fix answers. Okay, or as Richard Smith says, the strong man or woman in this case. The trouble is, people that we say we can get things done aren't necessarily doing it in the right way. Something not recognized, and I urge you read the works of Terry Boardman. He's spoken here before, and we'll have him back. Read Terry Boardman's articles, look him up. He is so sharp on history, and European history especially. He points out, and many people don't understand this, the EU is at least partly a creation of the US. And people like Jean Monnet worked very closely with the US to create a superstate here in Europe that the US could control very easily. Instead of having to deal with lots of different small compartments in different countries, it was in their interest to have us under one thumb. And that's not even conspiracy theory, that is factually true. Go and look up the origins of the EU and look how much America was involved in it. And of course, right now, we've got the whole TTIP thing going on. Now, some say, us having now voted for Brexit, okay, some are saying that will make things worse. Because TTIP is this, if you don't know, this trade alliance between Europe and America that's being set up that could, in theory, give American corporations the right to sue governments over here in Europe that don't do what they want. And it basically takes away all freedom and sovereignty. So some are saying, well, it's better out of Europe. Others are saying, no, it might not be, because we might do our own deal over TTIP. Although, as Obama has so kindly told us, we'll be at the back of the queue now. So, well, maybe it'll be delayed. But what I'm saying here is there are still massive issues to be fixed. And it's not yet clear which way stuff like this is going to go. And what do people like the Bilderbergs think and the Council on Foreign Relations? The Bilderbergs, of course, are very powerful. They influence decisions made around the world, and the same for the Council for Foreign Relations. As far as we can tell, they're not very happy about the Brexit vote. It wasn't what they expected, and what they're going to do in response remains to be seen. But bear in mind, Christine Lagarde of the International Monetary Fund is a key Bilderberger, and she had been very loud in saying Britain should not do this. Now, was this a reverse psychology, or is it, as I suspect, genuinely that they were expecting it to go the way they thought, and it hasn't? There will be unexpected consequences of this. Will they try to make us an example of us? I don't know. And over in Europe, if you do live in Europe, things could change. There are many nations in Europe champing at the bit for their own referenda, and you can feel that's being held down as long as possible. Will Britain be responsible for breaking up the European Union? I don't think it will, personally, but I think change will come. And I think it will be good change in the long run, because I think people are beginning to realize that the fact that a whole nation's decided it doesn't want to be part of it anymore is not something you can just ignore. And people like Hollande and Jean-Claude Juncker, they've been a bit spiteful about what we've done and threatening kind of retribution and making it very difficult for us to leave. Although, interestingly, Angela Merkel has been a bit more in the middle there with, well, that wouldn't serve us to do that, especially not given how much trade Germany does with us. And they've still got to trade with us, and we have to trade with them. A deal will be sorted out somewhere down the line. As I said earlier, the danger is it'll be a great British fudge, right, where nothing changes. I hope it won't be quite like that. But the future is uncertain for Europe and, of course, for Britain. Will we be Britain? Because, of course, now Scotland and even Northern Ireland, even Cornwall, I don't think that's going to happen, are threatening to go solo. Really worth a look at the map of who voted to leave and who voted to stay. So basically, if you squash it all together, bar the odd little blip, London voted to remain, mostly. Scotland and Northern Ireland. It's a divide, isn't it? And I don't like divide and rule, but you do have to acknowledge there's something going on here. The fact is, Scotland is going to go independent. That is my safe prediction. I was in Scotland a couple of years ago, and it was absolutely obvious when those younger generations do eventually come through, they want to go independent. And now, of course, this has been accelerated because they feel now what's happening is not going to serve them. It is very, very likely that we will wind up with a disunited kingdom. And we're going to have to deal with that. But is that entirely a bad thing? Because out of this might become something new. And England and Wales, and they will probably be the two that might remain. We just don't know about Northern Ireland. I don't know if that can easily just merge with Southern Ireland after all the sectarian tensions there, but we'll see about that. But maybe we will become stronger. A lot of people have been saying for ages, actually, we need better representation in this nation. We need more regional assemblies. We need to stand up, not just as part of Britain, but to be a nation in our own right. These are things that will all be on the table soon enough. So divide and rule is currently still alive and well, especially on the internet. It must stop now. Even if you wanted to remain, okay, I accept why you might feel hurt, but the slanging has got to stop. Because here's the thing. I think what I feel at the moment is we're being played. And if you don't want divide and rule, don't allow yourself to be played. Moderate your language. Fine, express your opinions, but now try to find a different way to get what you want. Just saying, you're wrong, you won by lies, you're a horrible leaver, is not going to cure anything, and it's going to make it worse. It's got to change. We need to kiss and make up. Yes, there are financial issues, right? Mark Carney, who is the governor of the Bank of England, of course, famously said things before the run-up to the vote that sounded biased, and he's taken flack for that. We mustn't talk down the economy either, right? If we want to get on, we are where we are, we've got to accept that for now. We've got to actually start talking it up. To be fair to Carney, at least the Bank of England did put some contingency measures in place that have stopped things falling as much as they might. And we always knew there would be some kind of economic earthquake. It's actually not been as bad as many feared it might be. But it is an issue. So listen, jingoism has no place in our society. Britain no longer rules the waves, and we shouldn't worry about that anymore. We don't have an empire, we don't need an empire. But there's nothing wrong with feeling a little proud of your nation. And the division in the nation, okay, is currently being used to once again make us feel like a failed state. But I hope that history will repeat and will actually instead see this time as an opportunity to rethink who we are as a people. Because this is the thing, we have right now a blank sheet. And if everybody acts accordingly, and if the Daleks, right, are at least not entirely evil, we might be able to actually set up some new kind of vision for who we are as a country. It's an opportunity, like it was in the English Civil Wars, to rethink everything. Now, let's quote the man that so many people quote, because it's worth quoting. George Orwell was a funny one. On one level, he was very concerned about the English and their small-mindedness. On the other hand, he was very proud. And this was said in context of England rather than Britain, but I think it still stands today. And one of his famous quotes was this: "We must add to our heritage or lose it. We must grow greater or grow less. We must go forward or backward." I believe in England, and I believe that we shall go forward. And I think that's exactly where we are now. We have to choose to go forward. Even if what's happened wasn't what you wanted, okay? Nonetheless, we are where we are. If you're given a lemon, you make lemonade, yes? We've got now an opportunity to do that. And rather than creating some silly empire and pretending we're as big as everyone else, instead, what we could create is a nation of true tolerance, of true understanding, genuine, successful multiculturalism. We are a multicultural society. This cannot be escaped. So let us celebrate that and make it work. We could set an example to the world of how a nation can stand in its own right, okay, with all the history that's behind us and that, and we will make it work. Because if we don't, yeah, absolutely, we will fall apart. And I don't believe that serves anybody at all. So let's use the opportunity that we've got ahead of us to say, right, okay, that's happened. This is the level playing field. How can we now build to be a people that we're proud to be? We do need to work in harmony with Europe. We are European. We need to embrace all. I believe there is a way to make it work. And I believe if we all set our minds to it, it will. So I commend this speech to the House, and thank you for listening very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy Thomas.
Thank you.